concerned somebody else is doing that. I was not prepared for that. Where can I find these questions? You can just send me a message and I'll gladly do that.
Sure. So as soon as the questions start coming in, I'll keep my YouTube open on my cell phone and I can just send it to you from there because we are on my laptop. I'm on Teams at the moment.
Oh, you're referring to the questions on the YouTube stream. That's okay, no worries. I'll be able to handle that. It's okay. Thank you.
From our audience. I just wanted to ask while we're here, is anyone on YouTube? How is it looking on YouTube? Like, are there a lot of people that have logged in? Hi, Ms. Campbell. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Kevin, the chair.
Hey guys, what are you guys doing?
Yes, likewise. I believe that you actually met some of our members at the Trinity project where they were doing the vaccination.
It was for the Caitlin Delpit Foundation. I met the lady because I was hosting, I was asked to be a judge at the South. That's where we
Which is great, and we're quite excited to hear the news that you had worked with our members.
Yes, it was an absolutely great opportunity, and I'm so thankful for them inviting me as much as we can get out, as much visibility as possible. So it was actually a pleasure to meet them and to find out that some of them were actually queer. So it was a great pleasure.
Yes, 100.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I just want to confirm that I am audible.
I think we are ready to begin and we can start streaming if that's fine, and Pamisa. So good evening, everyone present today, and a very good day to all of our friends from the GMT-4 side of the world. And my name is Previn Rami, and I'm the current chairman of the Wit Students Bioethics Society. And I want to welcome each and every one of you present today, and thank you for joining us for this very intriguing lecture on human rights in the space of biomedical ethics and health law. As the Wit Students Bioethics Society, we are a unique and attractive platform across the Faculty of Health Sciences, which serves as an advocate for the Declaration of Helsinki, as well as the Nuremberg Code, which outlines biomedical ethics and health law. So I think today it would be very incomplete if I don't comment on the current situation across the country, because we as a bioethics society strongly and urgently appeal that all that reside in the country at this moment to remain calm, desist from any criminal activity, and to follow the National Department of Health guidelines for the COVID-19 pandemic. We strongly condemn the multiple undesirable bioethical consequences that has emerged following the violent protest action across the country, such as the theft of pharmaceutical dispensaries, which violates federal laws such as Medicines and Related Substances Control Act, as well as the Narcotics Act, as well as the theft of the South African National Blood Bank stores, which violates the Human Tissues Act. for the unlawful possession of pharmaceutical drugs and human blood and blood products, respectively. In addition to the significant federal violations, the sick are unable to receive life-saving medication and/or blood products during the third wave of COVID-19. We also condemn the obstruction of the motorways across the country that is preventing multiple healthcare workers as well as ambulances from reaching their respective clinical sites, as well as treating the critically ill patients. So with that said, I also want to take a small moment of silence for those that have lost their lives to COVID-19, or for the numerous geopolitical tragedies across the globe, such as what we see happening in Israel, Palestine, Cuba, Myanmar, as well as what is happening in our own country at the moment. The basic tenets of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, and any other form of bigotry is a direct violation to the Hippocratic Oath. Healthcare is a basic human right, and one cannot practice medicine while propagating bigotry. So therefore, we are immensely humbled and honored to host such experienced speakers this evening. So I don't want to keep up too much of everyone's time. I'm now going to hand you over to Professor Kevin Behrens, our director for the Steve Biko Center of Bioethics in the School of Clinical Medicine, who will now introduce our guest speaker today. And we're extremely humbled and privileged to have such an amazing guest speaker today. But before I go on, I just quoted Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think it's a very apt introduction to today's presentation, because it states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and consciousness and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. And I think it's a very apt act that we should all abide by and all remember when we practice medicine or in any space of our normal lives. I'll now hand you over to Professor Kevin Behrens, who will address us and as well as introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Praveen, for that introduction. Thank you also to the Students Bioethics Society for organizing this event, and I expect, as usual, for it to be a very valuable and worthwhile event, as I've got used to with the Society over the years. So we can, I think, and we should celebrate the victories and some of the progress that has been made towards establishing the rights of LGBTIQ plus individuals. When I entered university, now just on 40 years ago, it was inconceivable that South Africa would have a constitution that prohibits discrimination on the grounds of gender and of sexual orientation. And the idea that same-sex marriage would be legal seemed like science fiction at the time. And yet, with Mandela Day just a few days away from us, instead of going into this weekend celebrating our liberation and democracy, we find ourselves mourning loss of life and looking on in horror at the scenes that we have seen this week of destruction, of violence, of hatred, that we've witnessed in so many of our communities. It's a terrible and stark reminder, I think, of how democracy and a Bill of Rights and good laws are simply no guarantee that people will be protected from harm. Despite our legal protections, between 12th of February and 22 April this year, at least 6 LGBTQ people were killed in South Africa. Lesbians in this country continue to be raped by men purportedly to somehow or the other teach them a lesson. And in some communities, just how someone dresses or how they walk can lead to a violent assault. Even in the relative safety of the leafy suburbs, in public, I still very cautiously read a room before showing physical affection to my husband. There is much to celebrate, but there's also a long road ahead. And even where our rights are enshrined in law, they are still often neglected, threatened, or denied. COVID-19 pandemic has made the vulnerable even more vulnerable and threatened rights even more than usual. Now, our guest speaker this evening is far better positioned than I am to give an account of how the pandemic has had an impact on LGBT rights, broadly speaking. And so without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Graham Reid is currently the director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Rights Program of Human Rights Watch. He's an expert on LGBT rights, as well as an anthropologist by training. He's conducted research, taught and published extensively on gender, sexuality, LGBT issues and HIV/AIDS. Dr. Reid was the founding director of the Gay and Lesbian Archives of South Africa, a researcher at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, and a lecturer in lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender studies at Yale University, where he continues to teach as a visiting lecturer. So, Dr. Reid, welcome, and thank you for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Previn and the organizers for inviting me to this event. I'm particularly thrilled to be speaking today, especially as a Wits alum. And I'm going to start, what I'm going to talk about today is to give a little bit of background to Human Rights Watch and specifically to the LGBT Rights Program, to give some information about the work that we do. And then I'm going to focus on abuses in medical settings, which I thought would be most apt for this particular talk. And then I'll look specifically at the impact of COVID-19, and then ask some questions about the usefulness of identity as a framework for thinking about vulnerability. And I'd also look forward to the opportunity to engage in the Q&A session after the talk. So some background on Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch monitors and documents human rights abuses around the world. We currently work in some 90 countries, and there are about 500 staff members located in various parts of the world. The organization is organized around both regional and thematic divisions. And by that, I mean that there is an Asia division that focuses on human rights abuses in that region. There's an Africa division, there's an Americas division, a US program, and so on. And in addition to that, there are a range of thematic divisions. A program that focuses specifically on refugees. There's a women's rights division, a disability rights division, a children's rights division, a women's rights division, and these divisions work closely together. So thematic divisions and regional divisions collaborate in documenting the human rights abuses that we are focusing on. And the methodology that we use is to investigate abuses that take place. And what this consists of, a researcher meeting with those people directly, as well as to interview perpetrators of abuse. The primary aim is to establish the facts of what has happened. The entire reputation of the organization rests on the accuracy and reliability of the information that we provide. So we go to great lengths to ensure that what we publish is accurate. And in the history of the organization, we have never had to retract a report based on the unreliability of the material. And that material is then compiled into a report, and typically a report will have a series of recommendations attached to it. Now, some of those recommendations are aspirational and some of them are realistic. To give you a random example, is we did a report on the Cameroon looking at arrests of LGBT people there. Now, one of the recommendations is that there should be decriminalization of same-sex activity in Cameroon. That's not a realistic goal at this point, but another recommendation was a moratorium on arrests. and that's a more achievable goal in the short term. And we measure the success or otherwise of our work against the extent to which those recommendations are met or not. And the purpose of doing the research and drawing attention to the research and the abuses that we document is to bring about systemic change. And primarily that is change around law and policy. And as Professor Behrens has pointed out, is law and policy is not always a panacea, but that is the focus of our work, to ensure that countries are compliant with their existing obligations in terms of international human rights law. Now, the LGBT program within Human Rights Watch was established 6 years ago, and Human Rights Watch was the first mainstream human rights organization to have a program dedicated to the rights of LGBT people. And that seems to me a particularly important development, primarily because the rights of LGBT people are often not recognized as legitimate human rights concerns, and rather they are relegated to the terrain of morality, of culture, of religion. And so having an LGBT rights program within a mainstream human rights organization like Human Rights Watch has a practical purpose, but it also plays a very important symbolic role. The program itself has 8 staff members, 6 of whom are researchers, some full-time, some part-time, and we cover the globe. So the only way we are able to do that, of course, is by working in close collaboration with various country experts in Human Rights Watch and with various other divisions who assist us in our work and alert us to the kinds of issues that we would then research in further depth. As has been mentioned, if we look at the long arc of history, there's been remarkable progress made in terms of the rights of LGBT people, certainly in South Africa and also globally. One of the measures of that would be the number of countries who have decriminalized over the last decades. And another marker and measure of progress has been the recognition of same-sex relationships, which has progressed remarkably swiftly. But of course, there are extraordinary challenges that remain. One of the examples of that is the number 16 that prohibits same-sex conduct. We've also seen recently the alarming increase in political homophobia. 2 current examples: in Poland, where local authorities have declared areas LGBT ideology-free zones. Now, these are not legally binding declarations, but they send a very strong message that LGBT people are not welcome in those regions of Poland. Similarly, Hungary has recently passed a law that bans the promotion or portrayal of homosexuality in the vicinity of children. And this is in the context of also banning adoption by same-sex couples and preventing transgender people from changing their legal gender. Now, just today, the European Commission has started to institute infringement proceedings against both Poland and Hungary based on these developments in their respective countries. And it is the case that LGBT rights have become something of a symbolic marker of broader conflicts within the EU. It's no coincidence that both Poland and Hungary have right-wing autocratic populist governments who have hardly been respectful of democracy writ large. We also see currently a disturbing development in Ghana, where some 21 activists have been arrested, and their trial was just postponed yesterday. We have a researcher currently in Ghana interviewing the 21, and they are all activists who were basically conducting a workshop with others in Ghana, and we are concerned that there is a likelihood of a private members bill being introduced in Ghana, which would further restrict the rights of LGBT people, specifically focusing on public expressions of identity. And this is a trend that we've been seeing globally that is a disturbing one. Another area of concern is the rise of the so-called anti-gender movement. And this is a movement that is visible and active both in Europe, in Latin America, and Africa. It's a well-resourced movement, much more sophisticated in its approach, and is operating in human rights spaces that that these kinds of groups have not traditionally operated in. And the anti-gender movement targets quite a broad range of rights, namely reproductive rights, LGBT rights with a specific focus on transgender rights, also attacks on comprehensive sexuality, education, and perhaps bizarrely, also laws around domestic violence. And the reason for that is that the Istanbul Convention has a fairly broad, the Istanbul Convention, which is the convention protecting women from violence, has a provision and a definition of gender that is sufficiently broad. So one of the aspects that we look at is conversion therapy, also known as sexual orientation change efforts. And this is the deliberate attempt to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. One of the reports we did was in China, where we showed that both in private and public hospitals, this was a widespread practice. It varies from kind of herbal teas and talk remedy to really extreme forms like electric shock therapy. And conversion therapy has been shown to cause considerable harm, especially to children. And this has led the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity to call for a global end to the practice. Another issue in which we have done an extensive multi-country report is on forced anal testing. Now, most laws that forbid same-sex interaction require people to be caught in the act. And so this notion of forced anal testing, which has absolutely no scientific value or evidentiary purpose, is used as a kind of form of humiliation that can, in certain instances, rise to the level of torture. It's routinely used in Egypt. It's commonplace in Tunisia, but also in Uganda, Tanzania. It's occasionally used even in Kenya. In Sri Lanka, Uzbekistan, and Cameroon, we've also documented the practice. And this is medical practitioners working together with law enforcement agents. Now, there's been quite a broad international movement against this practice, and a unanimous resolution from the World Medical Association, actually initiated by the South African Medical Association, condemning the practice and calling for an end to it. And I would also just say as a footnote that in our research, we found that not all doctors who were complicit in the practice were complicit in a rights abusing way. And by that, I mean that some doctors used this bad system and bad method to kind of to not really do any kind of a test and to say that there was no evidence of homosexual activity. So in other words, to make sure that the people who were on trial were not implicated. So they were kind of using the system to try and to the advantage of the suspects and in support of the suspect. So we did make a note of that in our reports, just to make it clear that not all doctors were complicit, or that they found a way to avoid being complicit in the abuses that were likely to occur. Another report that we brought out recently looks at sports, and this focused on women with naturally occurring higher testosterone levels, of which Caster Semenya would be a well-known example. And what we looked at is the invasive procedure rights abuse that occur. Women athletes are coerced into having unnecessary medical interventions in order to comply with athletic regulations. What our report shows is that this also targets women. Another area in the children. Now, these are children born with differences in sex characteristics and who are routinely subject to cosmetic, medically unnecessary surgeries with lifetime consequence and without their consent. And what the report says is that surgery should not occur until the child is old enough to consent. And some hospitals in the US, in Chicago and New York have recently changed their protocols. And in a hopeful development, India's Child Rights Agency is recommending a countrywide ban on these so-called normalizing surgeries. Another area has been on legal gender recognition for transgender people. And what we've argued for is a separation between medical procedures and legal documentation. So, for example, in Japan, where we've worked extensively on this topic, there are stringent requirements before you can change your legal documents, including sterilization. And until a few years ago, the same was true in the Netherlands and in many countries in Europe, but those laws have been recently updated and changed. Another current area has been access to medical care for transgender youth. A law was recently passed in Arkansas that prohibits access to care for transgender youth there, and that goes against the standards of care recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. In December, the UK High Court ruled that children under the age of 16 could not consent to drugs known as puberty blockers, which were designed to give trans-identified youth time to decide on gender transition by delaying the onset of puberty. Puberty blockers are part of the standard of care for trans youth in several countries, including the Netherlands and the US. So with that background on our work on in medical settings or relating to medical topics more generally, I'll now turn to the COVID-19 pandemic and aspects of inequality. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, Madonna, and I didn't think I would be quoting from Madonna in a talk, but here goes. Madonna referred to COVID-19 as the great equalizer. And she made this comment on social media from a rose-petaled bathtub. Now, she had been infected by COVID early on, and she got a lot of response, a lot of flack for that comment, and so she retracted it. And of course, what she was trying to say is that the virus can infect anyone, which is absolutely true. But what she was downplaying or ignoring was the social dimension of disease. And that is clear that poorer people are likely to face higher rates of infection, face more serious complications, and will suffer a disproportionate economic burden relating to the pandemic. And of course, in South Africa and elsewhere in the world, we've seen this very clearly with the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the kinds of cofactors that lead to vulnerability. So that while everyone is vulnerable, there's a disproportionate effect on the poor and the socially marginalized. And this brings me to the phrase or the concept of LGBT people as more vulnerable to COVID. And what I want to do is to unpack that a little bit and think about what is meant by that. I'm going to look at some specific instances of discrimination that we've documented and responded to in relation to the COVID pandemic and some of the examples of our response. And I'm also going to look at other factors that are not to do with identity per se. And so I'll be asking the question, what are the limits of looking at vulnerability through the lens of identity? And in other words, to what extent is the statement LGBT people are more vulnerable accurate or not accurate, and why? So clearly a crisis amplifies existing inequalities. So the social and economic hierarchies that predate the pandemic are also reproduced within it. And our research in the LGBT program at Human Rights Watch, and this, by this I mean prior to the pandemic, shows that around the world there's a link between vulnerability to human rights abuses and poverty and inequality. Let me give you some examples. We conducted 2 reports over a period of 10 years in Jamaica, and the reports focused on violence and discrimination experienced in that country. And what we found is that violence and discrimination against poorer LGBT Jamaicans was widespread and commonplace, whereas middle-class activists say they did not often share those experiences and didn't recognize themselves in the report that we had produced. So we had to qualify the report to make it clear that we were talking about a particular constituency. And one of the most vulnerable groups were the homeless queer youth on the streets of Kingston, the capital of Jamaica, who had difficult experiences at home and then subsequently also at school that led them to drop out and seek refuge in the city. And in fact, partly on that basis, we embarked on a whole series of reports that looked at bullying at school for this precise reason, is that vulnerability as adults could be tracked back to experiences as children, whether in the home, in a hostile home environment, or a hostile school environment in which LGBT kids faced high levels of bullying. So we've done reports in the US, we've done reports in Russia, Japan, Philippines, and in September we'll release a report on South Korea. We also did an extensive report looking at the scourge of violence against lesbians in South Africa. And similarly, the experience of township-dwelling Black lesbians in South Africa is a world apart from South African lesbians who are affluent. Now, this is not to say that both groups wouldn't face discrimination and abuse across the class divide, but the systemic nature of violence against poorer lesbians is linked to economic inequality as well as to identity. And similarly in Kenya, where we did a report on gay and transgender youth who found themselves homeless after being chased from their homes by angry groups acting in that instance on rumors of a gay marriage, were targeted for abuse because they were poor. And similarly in Ghana, lesbians in Ghana have nowhere to turn when families turn abusive. The law does not protect them, and it's hard for them as women to establish economic independence. So in that instance, it's the experience of women who are economically dependent on their families. And then an added layer is the fact of being lesbian and the risk of alienation from their families and hence their livelihood that can come about if their sexual orientation is exposed. We recently did a report on Ghana that focused on that specific issue. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted these class divisions in multiple ways. And I'm going to give some specific examples now of specific forms of discrimination against LGBT people that have occurred in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The first relates to arrests under the pretext of COVID-19 regulations. Now, a very stark example of this occurred in Uganda, where some 21 homeless youth were arrested in a shelter. These were youths who had been rejected by their families, and under the pretense of enforcing presidential directives to slow the spread of COVID-19, they were arrested and severely mistreated in prison. In fact, in an unprecedented development, they were paid compensation when they were released from prison because of the abuses that had occurred and the wrongful arrest that had taken place, thanks to the tireless work of Ugandan-based advocacy groups who succeeded in achieving that goal. The next specific instance of discrimination related to the COVID pandemic is gender-based quarantines and discrimination against transgender people. And here the example that comes to mind is in Panama. Certain cities in Colombia did a similar quarantine. And so in Panama, in an effort to reduce the number of people on the streets at any one time, the Panamanian authorities introduced a gender-based quarantine whereby men would go out on one day and women would go out on another day. And transgender Panamanians found themselves between a rock and a hard place because whatever day they went out on, they were harassed by the security forces and by the security personnel who were enforcing the COVID regulations. So every time someone went into a shop, there would be someone there to check their ID. And because there isn't a simple legal gender recognition system in place in Panama, is that the people's ID didn't match their gender presentation. And so we intervened in that by documenting the experiences of transgender people in Panama. We didn't come down one way or another on the gender-based quarantines because we didn't have the evidence one way or another as to whether they were effective or not. But what we did say was that whatever measures that are put in place, that they should not include the kinds of abuses that were being experienced by transgender people, and that something needed to be done about that. And some 5 ministries responded positively in Panama to say that they would take steps to ensure that this discrimination didn't occur. So that was a short-term response, but it lays the groundwork for longer term work, which is really about ensuring that Panama institutes a legal gender recognition system that is straightforward and not onerous. So that was something that we're currently working on with a view to bringing about more long-term systemic change in Panama. Another issue that's related and similar to what's happened in Panama is abuse by officials enforcing the curfew. And here we documented an instance in which young Filipinos were targeted by curfew enforcing local officers who treated them with mock social and economic margins. It's also the case that pre-existing stigma has been amplified in the pandemic. An example here is in South Korea, where the origin of a particular outbreak was identified as a club, and the media presented it, which was true, that it was a gay club, basically. But because that was in the public domain and identified as a gay club, is that people who had been present there were reluctant to come forward or were afraid of being traced because of the kind of social stigma that exists in South Korea, and were afraid that their livelihoods, their jobs would be jeopardized and that they would be outed to their families. Another aspect that is worthy of highlighting is the political opportunism. And here again, Hungary's populist leader, Viktor Orban, used COVID-19 emergency powers to rush through discriminatory legislation against transgender people. Now, that legislation would have probably passed in any event, but nevertheless, it was fast-tracked under the guise of the emergency regulations associated with COVID. We've also seen a lack of access to means of support by government or social networks. And here I would refer to a work that we're currently doing in South Africa, where we're doing a research report that looks at the experiences of LGBT migrants from the rest of the continent who have fled to South Africa seeking sanctuary. And, many people live very precarious lives, and they were not eligible for the government-issued emergency relief packages. And also, very significantly in this respect, is that they were not able to access the kind of support networks that refugees and migrants can often access, precisely because of homophobia. So that the kinds of informal networks were largely closed down to them, and that they needed then to turn to the couple of organizations that are operating, notably PASOP in Cape Town and the Fruit Basket in Johannesburg, who were tried to provide some emergency relief to the migrants who found themselves in desperate and dire situations. In positive news, India took specific measures to support transgender sex workers whose livelihoods had dried up in the pandemic. And this points to a broader issue, is that for many LGBT people, for various reasons, including employment discrimination, find themselves working in the informal sector, traditionally associated with particular roles. So, for example, waria, loosely translated as transgender in Indonesia, are often employed in the beauty industry. Ladyboys in Thailand have a niche in performance, while in India, hijras make a living from arms, ritual occasions, or sex work. And these are precarious livelihoods in the best of times, but in the pandemic, they have all but evaporated. The international LGBT rights group Outright Action International took a global survey on the impact of COVID-19 and also created an emergency relief fund. What was significant is that within weeks they had received 1,500 applications, including a disturbing number for food relief. Now, this also means that many LGBT organizations who have done advocacy or political work have needed to pivot away to more emergency relief work. And that has a long-term impact on the movement and the ability of the movement to be engaging more in the kinds of advocacy work that would achieve longer-term goals, and instead are forced to be attending to the immediate needs of the network that supports them. So to conclude, clearly there are specific instances of LGBT vulnerability during the pandemic. And this overlaps strongly with being socially and economically marginalized. So LGBT is, of course, not a monolith. And the COVID-19 pandemic also exposes the inequalities and divisions. And so this raises the question as to whether an identity lens in itself is an adequate way to approach the question of vulnerability. And, as the examples above have shown, the pandemic exacerbates existing inequalities. And just as certain sectors are more vulnerable to human rights abuses, as much of our reporting has shown, the same is true under COVID. So, Madonna's remark about the great equalizer, it's also true that an uncritical look at nominally shared experiences risks obscuring stark inequalities along socioeconomic lines that renders the phrase LGBT discrimination as potentially meaningless as Madonna's great equalizer musings. It's not wrong, but neither is it accurate. So our focus needs then to be on socioeconomic factors that lead to vulnerability and that can and do overlap with LGBT-specific discrimination and abuse. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for that presentation. I think it was truly, very interesting to hear about how the rights are changing, how LGBT rights affect so many people across the globe and how it's so different for us in South Africa, and I'm assuming for you guys in the States, and how it's so different for everyone else dependent on their geographic. Thank you so much, everyone, for waiting and for your patience. We are back online and we can continue the presentation. So, Monique, I'll hand over to you for the Q&A.
Okay, I'll be with you now. Let me just get the questions. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, Monique, we can't hear you, thanks.
Okay, one of the questions from our YouTube stream states, do you believe in the future, that in the future more countries will legalize homosexuality and same-sex marriages?
That's a good question. I think it's important just on a technical point to distinguish between same-sex conduct and homosexuality. So most laws are very specific about sexual practice and not identity. And what's been more disturbing recently is a trend that started really in Russia about actually making expression of identity, curtailing the ability to express identity. So the so-called gay propaganda law in Russia, which is a law that prohibits the the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations amongst children, has had very far-reaching effects because, of course, it prohibits, it has implications for media presentation because there's no way of monitoring whether children are present or not. But we've also found in our research reports that it means that teachers are inhibited from what they speak, and also disturbingly, mental health workers are afraid of being seen to promote homosexuality by having an open-ended discussion around sexuality more generally. And we've also seen that that law provokes a negative social response. And so there's been an uptick in violence, and quite brutal violence, in Russia, including gangs that have gone around as anti-pedophilia groups because of this association between pedophilia and homosexuality. And what they do is lure young gay men in particular, and then abduct them and torture them and film what they're doing and their humiliation of them, and then upload it onto social media sites. So it serves the purpose both of outing and humiliating in public the people that they are targeting. And what we find is that they do this with a high level of impunity. There have been very few arrests of anyone who engages in this activity and who feels that they need to do that. So that's a long-winded way of just sort of clarifying the parameters of the question. But what I would say is that we're certainly seeing a trend over time towards decriminalization. That said, there are always some exceptions, and we are concerned about the way in which there is a political capital in provoking kind of homophobic rhetoric at certain points in time. I think it's no mistake that we can see both in Poland and in Hungary that the level of homophobic rhetoric rises just prior to an election. So it's seen there to be a way of garnering votes. And then I think that around same-sex partnerships, same-sex marriage often provokes a very negative response. An example is Nigeria. A law that was passed in Nigeria is called the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act. Now, same-sex marriage is not possible in Nigeria in any event, so the law would be totally redundant. But the law does so much more than outlaw same-sex marriage. It basically forbids the expression of LGBT identity or any expression of same-sex affection in public, or any support of any LGBT group or organization, with very serious penalties. It's probably one of the most extreme laws that exist. Now, it is the case that it's seldom, it has sometimes been enforced, but it's seldom enforced. But nevertheless, it stays there as a threat to individuals and activists. So my answer is yes and no, is that as there's progress, there's often also organized resistance to that progress, and that there are places in the world that find a political value in going in the opposite direction.
Understandable. Thank you for your answer. Another question that we have states, what can we as clinicians specifically do to help our LGBT patients feel connected to us? And how can we learn about the best options for treating their specific concerns?
Okay, I think that's a great question. And I would say that it's really just about being very well informed around LGBT issues. I think that would go a long way. People sometimes have negative experience in their dealings with medical personnel, and that often originates in a kind of ignorance around what LGBT people, who they are and what they need. So I would say, yeah, being well informed would be a very good first step.
Thank you very much. That aside, I believe we have no other questions. If anyone else has any other questions, you can send it through YouTube. But that is all that we have over here. Thank you so much for your answers, Dr. Graham Reed.
Thank you.
Okay, I will be announcing our next speaker, Jermaine Jacobs, also known as Ms. Campbell, is a self-employed designer stylist, jeweler, robotics lecturer, and pageant drag queen, who currently holds the title of Miss Drag Queen South Africa 2020 to 2021. Their project for 2021, titled Drag Excellence South Africa, aims to showcase the diverse drag talent on the Southern African continent and propel South African drag onto the global drag scene. Furthermore, Ms. Campbell aims to open an LGBTQIA+ community center called Rainbow Ribbon South Africa, where skill workshops will be provided to raise awareness on LGBTQ+ issues, as they believe in the importance of sharing knowledge learned and paying it forward to younger generations. Please welcome Ms. Campbell.
Good evening, everybody. I'd love to send you all a lovely warm wishes and a cheerful hello from a very sad South Africa at the moment.
Ms. Campbell, you have the floor.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I'm experiencing a bit of a lag there. Sorry.
Oh, sure, no problem.
Alrighty. Well, hi, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. My name is Ms. Campbell, also known as Jermaine. I identify as non-binary. I'm 28 years of age. I'm from a little community called Westbury in the center of Johannesburg. I am also a self-proclaimed designer, stylist, all-around snazzy human being, and a drag queen from Johannesburg who is trying their best to make sure that I could spread enough knowledge, enough positive ethics towards any person who comes along my journey and who is there to lend a helping hand or to be any sort of assistance to any of our LGBTQIA+ members across the South African continent. And with my title as Miss Drag South Africa, the main ethos behind Miss Drag South Africa is Drag with a Purpose, which I started my own initiative where I was feeding a large group of people, between 700 to 800 people in the community of Westbury. It's called the Jacobs Family Community Project. It is based out in Westbury, where we feed a large group of people from the surrounding areas and communities around Westbury. It was started by my parents at the beginning of my parents and myself at the beginning of quarantine in 2019, 2020. At the moment, it's difficult to know where we are because we're still stuck in a pandemic. So with the kitchen, it has been running up until this very current moment, because at the moment it is extremely vital that we put forth a message of positivity and as much helping hands as possible as well. And I'd also like to give you a little bit more information about Digital Drag and Drag Excellence South Africa. It is a digital drag showcase where I will virtually visit 10 to 12 drag queens across the South African province, or in each province of South Africa, as many as possible. It will be a once-a-month show that will run up until the month of December, and it will be just a really large showcase of the tremendous talent we've got in South Africa, because I believe as Ms. Drag South Africa, I've got a very big responsibility to make sure I'm putting forth a platform for people to learn as much as possible about what it means to be part of the LGBTQIA+ community and the various talents and aspects of life that is under the LGBTQIA+ community. And my hopes is to slowly but surely evolve it into Rainbow Ribbon Essay, which is a foundation that I am currently in the midst of working on to erect in Johannesburg, and as well as Pretoria. There are 2 current missions I'm currently working on, just to make sure that I as Ms. Drag South Africa, can erect somewhere where I can leave a long-standing legacy behind, and I can pay my efforts forth to the younger generation with this specific LGBTQIA center, where I would invite any other LGBTQIA+ people who have any sort of motivation or power in their specific communities or in their circles. I would invite them to the center for you to pay your efforts forward into the community to teach the younger individuals the knowledge you already know, and also to just to give off your knowledge in terms of how you as a person, in terms of how you identify as an LGBTQIA+ person or ally, in terms of just being an ally towards the LGBTQIA+ community, would be the biggest goal that I'm trying to get to at the moment. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen and inviting me onto this platform.
Thank you for
No problem, Bala.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ms. Campbell. You are truly an inspiration to many young LGBTQ+ individuals in South Africa, and we love to hear about the work that you're doing along with the feeding scheme and all these other projects that you're working with on the side. Let me check YouTube to check for any questions for you.
Thank you so much.
From YouTube, there aren't any questions. Everybody watching, if you have any questions that you wish to send through, I'll give you a minute to send them through. But thank you, Ms. Campbell.
My pleasure. Go to you, my love.
Again.
It's a nightmare.
The question reads, how has your queer journey been? And what are the hardships that you have faced along the way? How have you tackled them?
Alrighty, so my queer journey has been extremely eye-opening, especially being a drag queen who identifies as non-binary. I am fully aware of my masculine and my feminine sides of myself, because as a drag queen, you really need to know yourself, inside, outside, top to bottom, what your ethos is going forth in life, what your message is going forth. So when it comes to me identifying as non-binary, it really has given me the ability to influence boys and girls, because that's where it really does play a really big role in what you're trying to do with the title, what you're trying to do with you as a person and your journey going forward. So my main goal going forth as a non-binary person, and also happy non-binary awareness week to everybody who is also identifying as non-binary in the comment section or actually watching this video right now. And as somebody who has identified as non-binary, I have not experienced any hardships because I'm such a strong and confident person in my drag and in myself as a human being and as a drag queen. So I really don't allow there to be an opportunity for there to be any sort of animosity within the circle I am, because I believe as a drag queen, you have to bring as much positive vibes towards any person or any scenario you're in.
Thank you very much for the answer. I'm certain that you are a huge inspiration to many other non-binary individuals, and like I mentioned, other individuals within the LGBTQ plus community. We thank you and happy Non-Binary Awareness Week to you as well. Thank you very much, Ms. Campbell. I believe those are all the questions that we have for you today.
Thank you so much.
I would like to call upon our next speaker. We're pleased to welcome Beaton Jones, all the way from the School of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Rochester. He is the Assistant Director of Partnerships and Communication of the Medical Student Pride Alliance, and today he will be sharing more about what this organization is about with you.
I know that person.
Thank you, Minnie. Can you hear me? I just want to double check.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So again, my name is Beaton Jones. I'm from the Medical Student Pride Alliance. I won't read off what the Medical Student Pride Alliance is because you just saw it, but I'll briefly just state that it's an activist and social organization that was founded in 2018 by students. It's led and managed by students, other medical students across the US. And the purpose we serve is really to support medical students of all gender and sexuality expressions, but particularly those who come from minorities within those categories. So we're not only supporting them, but we're also advocating on their behalf and trying to push the movement forward, as Dr. Reed was saying. So again, it started in 2018 with a couple students and has since really blossomed. I serve on the external affairs team, and we're really trying to become this umbrella organization for different chapters across the entire United States. I'm sure everyone here has read and seen different things about the political environment in the United States, and the United States is really going through a huge schism right now. Dr. Reed himself spoke to two examples that represent the two extremes of the United States. We have places like Chicago, metropolitan centers where you have progressive health policies for trans patients, but then you also have places like Arkansas that represent the other extreme, and they're limiting access to the most basic things that trans patients need, like hormones. And that's really what we're going through right now, and that extends to the COVID-19 pandemic.
I look so good. I look so good.
Ms. Campbell, hello there. So this extends to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen some bills pop up in different states that would potentially treat people with HIV more harshly for things like spitting on a cop, because we've found from COVID-19 that these respiratory infections can be spread through aerosols, which is a novel intel from this pandemic. Before, we thought that aerosols were too small to spread respiratory diseases or illnesses or viruses. And so now that we know that they can, we've seen the conservative wing of American politics attempt to harness that information to treat people with HIV more harshly, which is just scientifically incorrect. Luckily, that has not taken hold. We had a great political activist, Brian Sims, fight against that in the Pennsylvania legislature. But when it comes to trends, we see these two extremes in the United States fighting or vying for influence. I'm happy to say that the MSPA is here to represent science. We are a group of medical students, and we're very excited to have been connected with the WIT Society. Admittedly, we are really right now dedicated to building out our domestic network. But this is, we are very excited to have international touch points, and we're always interested in the international perspective. And I hope that's something that the MSPA can provide to the WIT Society and anyone else on the call as you have events moving forward. I met Previn last week on Zoom, and we talked about the potential of having some sort of talk on conversion therapy. And so I brought that back to the MSPA, and we're kind of already vetting some potential speakers or resources in case that comes to fruition. So really acting as a resource for the WIT Society, and then also for the WIT Society acting as a resource for us, is really how we see our partnership moving forward, which is really exciting. And the last thing I want to point out that one of the big things that the MSPA has done since it started was we developed an LGBTQ equity report card for medical schools. So it basically doesn't rank, but it evaluates medical schools based on how they actually act on what they say they are, meaning, equitable towards LGBTQ patients. You can say that all you want. It can be in your mission statement, but what are you doing in the curriculum? What are you doing for your students? And so we are evaluating them. And medical schools in the United States are very competitive, as I'm sure they are everywhere else. So we're kind of leveraging that competition and competitive nature so that people in different medical schools really, again, continue to push the movement forward and become the best when it comes to equity for LGBTQ patients. That's all I have to say. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer as best I can. I'm coming from my lab, my neuroscience lab that I'm working in for the summer, but happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I believe our next speaker is from the Science Faculty Council.
Thank you very much, Dean Jones. I'm just giving everyone on the stream approximately just 30 minutes plus minus, just for them to send in any questions if they have. But overall, thank you very much. We appreciate you sharing what you do.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
That appears to be all. Thank you once again. We appreciate you joining us today. We're now delighted to introduce our next speakers. They're fellow students of ours from the WIT Science Faculty Council. We'd like to welcome Rais Nurba and Nkosazana, and they will be discussing LGBT decolonization in science and medicine.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nkosazana Makoti. I'm the Vice Chairperson of the Science Faculty Council at Wits University. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Wits Students Bioethics Society for creating the safe space for these conversations to be had. I'm going to begin with discussing a scenario on how science and/or medicine linked to human sexuality, because there's a habit of people trying to use science as a means to justify their queerphobia. The prenatal hormone theory of sexual orientation, or PHT, states that same-gender same gender sexual orientation stems from the underexposure of male fetuses or overexposure of female fetuses to androgens. Now, androgens are responsible for sexual dimorphism that is expressed in physical features such as the face and our behaviors in adulthood. Science is the pursuit of knowledge, but it is how we choose to use this knowledge that defines us as scientists. Scientists need to understand the kind of impacts that their research has, because history has proven to us that science can either lead to our rise or our downfall. Scientists have used their knowledge of PhD to try and create an algorithm that can predict one's sexuality based on facial features alone and compare the accuracy to human perception. If this research holds water and the algorithm is misused, then it could pose a threat to the safety and privacy of the LGBTQI+ community. This is a perfect example of how our morals can be tested as a scientist. Science is about understanding that there are always exceptions to the rule, especially when it comes to biology. Variation is something you can always count on, which is why transphobic reasoning does not hold if you're using science as your basis, because you're choosing parts of science that are mostly binary to prove your points, which isn't an accurate representation. I'll use chromosomal identity as an example. Using this as a sole basis to determine gender does not work because it does not account for intersex people who are born with reproductive anatomy that does not fit in only the male or female box. Something amazing I stumbled upon is a non-profit organization called 500 Queer Scientists, co-founded by Lauren Esposito, an arachnologist. The organization is focused on boosting the recognition and awareness of LGBTQI+ people that work in STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. What I love about this organization is that people in a marginalized group have a space to voice their experiences and be celebrated for their work and their diversity. Students such as myself could benefit from being exposed to these role models, and one can only hope that this initiative can spread to Africa and more specifically, South Africa. STEM is hard enough as it is, and it sometimes feels pointless to pursue it further if you aren't exposed to people that you can relate to that have successfully made it in the field. And instead, we're exposed to cisgendered, heterosexual white men as the standard. As a faculty, I honestly think that we have a long road to go, but I'm hopeful because our generation is currently using their voices and they will be heard. Thank you.
Good evening, comrades. I hope everyone can hear me and see me. My name is Reis Noorbai. I am a writer and activist. I'm the chairperson of the Wit Student Forum and a member of the Socialist Youth Movement. I'm also the founder of the Decolonization of Science Reading Club. And we have been engaging with a number of issues through the Reading Club, and this actually aligned, this lecture aligned with what our focus was to be for this month, which was queer pride. And so I just want to speak to issues of queer pride, liberation, and decolonization. In Black Consciousness and the Quest for a True Humanity, Bantu Steve Biko argues that by aspiring to the identity of the oppressor, to the role of the oppressor, Black people are insulting the intelligence of whomever created them Black. This analysis holds despite one's position on God and religion, and it holds for any movement that seeks to defend the pride and dignity of those who are deemed subhuman. In the context of queer pride, this is instructive. It may be bizarre coming from someone who doesn't particularly believe in a deity, but to borrow Biko's language, as queer people, we must affirm that when God created us queer, God did so on purpose. A queer consciousness requires us to affirm and reaffirm that queer people, as Comrade Nkosazana has pointed out, are not an aberration in nature, but a natural variation. A variation that must be celebrated, not persecuted. The contemporary status quo, as Dr. Reed has detailed, tells a tragically different story, as does the historical record of colonization and dehumanization. It would be impossible for me, in the time I've been allotted today, in fact, even in the whole day, to merely list the crimes of European colonialism upon African soil. But one such crime is this. Many of the queerphobic laws on the books in African nations were initially placed there by European colonialists and then subsequently maintained by contemporary reactionaries and autocrats. Is it not then part of our decolonial mission to strike those laws off the books? It is also crucial for us to recognize that when those colonialists arrived in the countries they would then pillage and colonized, they saw us all as queer, as alien, outside the category called humanity and fit for subjugation. The queerphobia institutionalized within colonial law was another tactic of divide and conquer, shifting the focus away from the colonial monster and scapegoating a part of the colonized population. Comrades, let us never forget who the real enemy is. In understanding the decolonial project, we also cannot omit a critique of capitalism. Even in formerly colonized countries like our own, with constitutional democracies, queer people continue to endure material suffering on account of the fact that the social force of queerphobia acts through the machine of capital, a machine whose existence and maintenance on this continent cannot be separated from the brutal project of European colonization. Queer homelessness wouldn't exist if quality housing was an inalienable right guaranteed by the state. The hunger of ostracized queer people would simply not exist if our society centered the right to food above the profits of corporate agriculture. Let us not forget that the iconic thinker Frans Fanon was not merely a vocal, vicious critic of liberalism, of imperialism and colonialism, but also a champion of socialism as a means to truly liberate ourselves from the colonial legacy. Total liberation for queer people, for all those who have been colonized and dispossessed, cannot be separated from the implementation of socialism. In advancing this liberation, we must assert, first, control over our own psychology. As we march forward towards queer liberation, let Biko remind us to remember that we must never allow those who oppress us to control our minds, because that is the most potent weapon in their hands. To remind us that we must never let them intimidate us in an attempt to make us abandon our conviction in justice and dignity and pride. Our pride is an act of defiance. For as long as our existence is not recognized and respected, we must resist. Thank you for your time, comrades.
Thank you to you both. We appreciate your time for that informative session. I'll allow for approximately a minute to see if any questions do come through. Some questions have been coming through a bit delayed, so I'll allow that time. After a minute, we will have a little general Q&A to catch up on all the questions for the other speakers that came through late. Thank you. Very well, we're having a general Q&A session. Questions are open. If you have a question that you had earlier, which you still wish to share. My first question is for Deaton Jones.
Hello.
Hi. Okay, this question says, is it possible for the MSPA to facilitate a session to discuss medical therapy available to trans individuals within the public health sector?
Yeah, that's definitely something that that we would be interested in putting together. Is this from someone from the WITS Bioethics Society, this question, or in general?
This is a question from our YouTube stream, so it's one of our viewers.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to encourage you to go to medpride.org and put yourself on our newsletter list. So that way, when we do have an event like that, you'll be the first to know. But I will note that as a event that, you know, one of the listeners is interested in. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Can you please repeat that one more time? Medpride.org, so we can just write.
ORG, medpride.org.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our next question is for... This one is for Ms. Campbell. So Ms. Campbell, if you would please join again.
Hello.
Hello. The question is, what advice would you give to youth who are currently in their journey being queer, they're struggling to accept themselves, and they're just going through the process of discovering themselves?
Alrighty, well, my big advice that I give to people who come across me as a drag queen is to really find your tribe and to realize that your chosen family and your chosen circle is vitally important in evolving who you are as a queer person, because queer people thrive on support. So the more support you have, the easier your journey will be.
Thank you for the advice. And that aside, currently we don't have any more questions. You can send them through and I'll call on to the next speaker. Thank you very much, Ms. Campbell. We appreciate it.
All right, if there's no further questions, then that brings us to the end of our event. So on behalf of the WITS Students Bioethics Society, I'd like to say thank you to all the amazing speakers we had today. Dr. Reed, we appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak to us about issues around the world regarding the LGBTQI+ community and for all the important work that the Human Rights Watch is doing. Ms. Campbell, we really appreciate you sharing your experiences with us and allowing us to share and amplify your message on our platform. We're grateful for collaborative opportunities with other student organizations. So thank you to Deaton, Nkosazana, and Reese for sharing your perspectives and efforts made by your respective student organizations. Thank you to our wonderful audience for attending and for such insightful questions. And thank you for making this another successful event. We hope for a safer South Africa, and we look forward to hosting more events in the future. Keep safe, everyone, and keep conscious.
Keep safe, everyone.
Thanks everyone for that very informative presentations. I think we've learned so much. And I think as healthcare professionals, we are much more prepared to uphold that Hippocratic oath and not practice any forms of bigotry. So I think we're just going to give everyone 5 minutes to join us for the meet and greet